August 23, 1942. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The summer air over the Volga River is thick with smoke. At first, the sound arrives as a distant hum. Then it grows louder, heavier, until the sky itself begins to vibrate. Hundreds of German aircraft from the Luftwaffe sweep over the city in formation. Bomb bays open. Within seconds, the first explosions tear through the streets of Stalingrad. Factories collapse into clouds of dust. Apartment blocks crumble. Oil tanks erupt into towering columns of fire that burn through the night. Thousands of civilians run toward the riverbanks, searching for any form of escape. But the bombing does not stop. By the end of that single day, entire districts are gone. More than 40,000 people are dead, and Stalingrad has been transformed into a shattered landscape of concrete, twisted steel, and burning rubble. For the German High Command, this destruction is meant to clear the way for victory. But the ruins will do something no one expected. They will turn Stalingrad into a battlefield where armies disappear, where survival lasts hours, not days, and where the dead will number in the millions. Because this city on the Volga is about to become the deadliest battlefield in human history. But to understand how Stalingrad reached this moment, we must begin 1 year earlier, when the war in the East first exploded. June 22, 1941. Before sunrise, the eastern frontier of Europe erupts into chaos. Across a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers, more than 3 million German soldiers surge into the Soviet Union. Tanks roll across the border. Artillery opens fire. Aircraft swarm overhead in endless waves. This is Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. For Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, the objective is simple but enormous: destroy the Soviet Union in a single, crushing campaign. The Wehrmacht expects the Red Army to collapse within months. German planners believe the war in the East will end before winter arrives. At first, the invasion unfolds exactly as planned. German armored spearheads punch deep into Soviet territory with devastating speed. Entire Soviet armies are surrounded and destroyed. Cities fall one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union has suffered staggering losses. Millions of soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. Vast territories are occupied. The German army stands only a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. Yet the Soviet state does not collapse. Factories are dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. New armies are formed. Reserves from Siberia are deployed. And when the brutal Russian winter arrives, German forces, exhausted and undersupplied, begin to stall. The lightning victory Hitler expected never comes. When 1942 begins, the war in the East enters a new phase. Germany still holds enormous territory, but the Red Army remains alive, rebuilding, reorganizing, and preparing for another year of total war. Hitler now faces a difficult decision. Instead of renewing the direct assault on Moscow, he shifts his attention southward. His eyes turn toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the vital fuel supply that powers the Soviet war machine. Without that oil, the Red Army cannot fight. To reach those fields, German forces must advance through southern Russia along the great waterways of the region. And standing directly in the path of that advance is a long industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. A city whose name carries enormous political weight: Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had become a contest of endurance. Germany still possessed the initiative, but the Soviet Union had not broken. Its factories were producing tanks and aircraft in staggering numbers, and fresh armies continued to appear along the front. For Adolf Hitler, the solution lay in the south. In April 1942, German planners prepared Case Blue, a massive offensive designed to push deep into southern Soviet territory. The primary objective was the Caucasus oil fields, especially the fields around Baku. Oil meant mobility, and mobility meant survival for modern armies. If Germany captured that oil, the Soviet war effort would be crippled. But there was another target along the route. Stretching for nearly 50 kilometers along the Volga River, the city of Stalingrad stood as one of the Soviet Union's major industrial centers. Its factories produced tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The Volga itself served as a vital transportation artery, carrying supplies from the southern regions to the Soviet interior. Control of Stalingrad would allow German forces to cut that supply line. Yet the importance of the city was not only military. Its name carried immense symbolic power. Named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the city represented the prestige of the Soviet state itself. Losing it would be a propaganda victory for Germany and a psychological blow to Soviet morale. By August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, approached the outskirts of the city. It was one of the most powerful formations in the German military, well-equipped, battle-hardened, and confident after months of success. Inside Stalingrad, Soviet defenses were organized under General Vasily Chuikov, a commander known for his aggressive and relentless style of warfare. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of civilians remained trapped in the city. Factories continued operating. Workers produced tanks even as artillery shells struck nearby streets. Many civilians joined defensive units or helped construct barricades and trenches. Then, on August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating air raids of the entire war. Within hours, Stalingrad was reduced to a landscape of shattered buildings and burning ruins. For the German army, it seemed like the city had been destroyed. But those ruins would soon transform Stalingrad into something far more dangerous. A battlefield where conventional warfare would collapse into a brutal struggle for every street, every staircase, and every room. By September 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had turned into something no military planner had expected. The city no longer resembled a functioning urban center. Entire districts had been flattened by bombing and artillery. Streets were buried under bricks, steel beams, and shattered concrete. Smoke drifted constantly above the ruins. Yet the battle only intensified. German units from the Sixth Army pushed steadily toward the Volga River. Their objective was clear: seize the remaining factories and cut the Soviet defenders off from the riverbank. But every meter of ground had to be fought for. Inside the ruins, Soviet soldiers of the 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, fought at extremely close range. Chuikov understood something critical about the battlefield. German forces relied heavily on artillery and air power. If Soviet troops stayed close enough to the enemy, sometimes only tens of meters away, German aircraft and artillery could no longer strike without risking their own soldiers. The result was a new kind of warfare. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. Fighting took place inside collapsed buildings, dark basements, stairwells, and factory floors. Snipers waited for movement across broken windows. Grenades were thrown through holes blasted in walls. Entire squads fought for control of single rooms. One building might change hands several times in a single day. The massive Red October and Barricade factories became fortresses of twisted metal and burning machinery. Workers had once built tanks inside these walls. Now soldiers fought among the assembly lines where those tanks had been produced. Despite the chaos, the German advance continued slowly. By October, German troops controlled nearly 90% of the city. Soviet defenders were pushed into narrow strips of land along the Volga River. Supply boats crossed the river at night, carrying ammunition and reinforcements while German artillery attempted to destroy them. To many observers, the fall of Stalingrad appeared inevitable. But behind the front lines, far from the ruins of the city, Soviet commanders were preparing something much larger. While the German army remained focused on capturing the final blocks of Stalingrad, the Red Army was quietly assembling massive forces along the exposed flanks of the German advance. Because the units guarding those flanks were not German. They were Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers. And in November 1942, the Soviet Union would launch an operation designed to shatter those lines and surround the entire German army inside the city. An operation that would change the course of the war. November 19, 1942. Before dawn, the frozen steppe north of Stalingrad erupts with the sound of artillery. More than 3,500 Soviet guns and rocket launchers open fire simultaneously. The barrage stretches across dozens of kilometers, shaking the ground beneath the Romanian defensive lines that guard the German flank. This is the beginning of Operation Uranus. For months, Soviet commanders, including General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasylovsky, had prepared this counteroffensive in secrecy. While German forces fought desperately inside Stalingrad, massive Soviet armies had been gathering beyond the horizon. Their target was not the city itself. It was the weaker Axis armies, protecting the sides of the German advance. The Romanian Third Army to the north and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south were thinly spread and poorly equipped to face the heavy Soviet armor now moving toward them. Within hours of the artillery barrage, Soviet tank formations begin to push forward. Columns of T-34 tanks roll through the smoke, supported by waves of infantry and artillery. The Romanian lines collapse under the pressure. Defensive positions are overrun, and entire units are forced into retreat. German commanders quickly realize the danger. But the scale of the Soviet attack is already overwhelming. By November 20, the southern pincer of the offensive strikes the Romanian forces south of Stalingrad with equal force. Once again, the defenses crumble under the combined weight of Soviet armor and artillery. Two enormous Soviet spearheads now race toward each other across the open steppe. Their objective is clear: meet behind the German Sixth Army and seal the trap. On November 23, 1942, near the small town of Kalach, the two Soviet forces finally link up. The encirclement is complete. Inside the growing pocket are more than 250,000 Axis troops, German soldiers, along with Romanian and other Allied units. Among them is the entire German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht. Suddenly, the army that had been pushing toward victory in Stalingrad finds itself surrounded on all sides. Supplies begin to run dangerously low. Fuel, ammunition, and food must now be delivered by air, a task assigned to the Luftwaffe. But the German Air Force cannot carry enough supplies to sustain such a massive force. Winter is approaching. And despite the worsening situation, Adolf Hitler refuses to authorize a breakout. The Sixth Army is ordered to hold its positions inside Stalingrad and wait for relief. But relief will never arrive. Instead, the pocket around the city will slowly tighten, turning the ruins of Stalingrad into a frozen prison for an entire army. By December 1942, the German army trapped inside Stalingrad was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting simply to survive. More than 250,000 soldiers were now confined within a shrinking pocket of ruined buildings and frozen streets. The Soviet Red Army had sealed the encirclement and was steadily tightening its grip around the city. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees C. Food supplies disappeared first. Daily rations shrank to a few hundred grams of bread. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Ammunition became scarce. Many wounded soldiers received little or no medical treatment as hospitals filled beyond capacity. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the trapped army by air, but the effort quickly collapsed under the scale of the task. German transport aircraft could deliver only a fraction of the 700 tons of supplies per day required to sustain the army. Most days, barely 80 to 100 tons arrived. Starvation, frostbite, and disease spread through the ranks. Meanwhile, Soviet forces launched continuous attacks, slowly reducing the German defensive perimeter. Entire divisions that had once advanced across Europe were now reduced to scattered groups of exhausted survivors defending isolated ruins. In January 1943, Soviet commanders launched Operation Ring, the final offensive designed to destroy the pocket completely. German resistance weakened rapidly. On January 30, 1943, Adolf Hitler promoted General Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. In German military tradition, no field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. The promotion carried a clear expectation. But the situation inside the city had become impossible. 2 days later, on January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the pocket to Soviet forces. The remaining German units in the north continued fighting for only a few more days. By February 2, 1943, organized resistance in Stalingrad finally ended. The battle had lasted nearly 6 months. Of the more than 250,000 Axis troops trapped inside the city, around 91,000 were taken prisoner. Only a small fraction would ever return home after the war. The total casualties from both sides, soldiers and civilians, exceeded 2 million people. No battle in history had produced destruction on this scale. And with the fall of Stalingrad, the momentum of the war on the Eastern Front shifted permanently against Nazi Germany. When the guns finally fell silent in February 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. Entire districts had vanished beneath mountains of rubble. Factories that once produced tanks and artillery now stood as twisted skeletons of steel. The Volga River flowed past endless ruins, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians had fought, suffered, and died. For months, the battle had consumed everything. Armies had been shattered, cities destroyed, lives erased in numbers so vast they were almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that more than 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured during the struggle for Stalingrad. No single battlefield in human history had ever witnessed such a concentration of death and destruction. But the significance of Stalingrad went far beyond the numbers. The battle marked the moment when the seemingly unstoppable advance of Nazi Germany was finally broken on the Eastern Front. The German Sixth Army, once one of the most powerful formations in Europe, had been destroyed. The myth of German invincibility had collapsed along with it. From that point forward, the Red Army would begin pushing westward, slowly, relentlessly, across the vast battlefields of Eastern Europe. The road would lead through Ukraine, Poland, and eventually all the way to Berlin. Yet the memory of Stalingrad would remain, not simply as a military turning point, but as a reminder of the terrible cost of total war. Because in the shattered ruins along the Volga River, the world witnessed how modern warfare could transform an entire city into a battlefield, and a battlefield into one of the deadliest places humanity has ever known. Stalingrad did not just change the course of World War II. It revealed, with brutal clarity, the true scale of destruction that war could bring to the world.